I'm Chris Moyer, and this is a Zpryme Now special report. As the world begins to focus more on what a clean energy transition looks like, we need to move away from simply focusing on the highest end customers who are able to afford the coolest electric vehicles or solar panels, and focus on a broad base and systemic approach to clean energy. To do that, I'm joined by Andrea Johnson, the Executive Director of Green Empowerment. Andrea, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much, Chris, for having me.
Our pleasure. Andrea, Green Empowerment does work around the globe in helping to bring clean electricity to rural communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about Green Empowerment and your mission?
Sure. Green Empowerment is a pretty small nonprofit based in the Pacific Northwest of the United States with a global footprint. And we really believe that access to renewable energy and clean water are basic human rights and basic infrastructure that's needed for more social justice globally. We work in partnership with local organizations to do this work. So that's really fundamental to our approach is we're not the installers, we're not the implementers. It's about helping organizations, whether they are nonprofits, community organizations, social enterprises themselves, do renewable energy and clean water projects in some of the most rural communities in their home countries. We believe that they're best suited to do this work, and it's our role to support them through technical support, administrative support, project management, and things like that.
Well, what are some of those projects that Empowerment is proudest of?
Yeah, so we got our start as an organization off of the legacy of Benjamin Linder, who was a US engineer killed in Nicaragua in the late 80s. And so some of our projects that we're most proud of are some of those very first projects that we started off of his legacy in Nicaragua. And I'll tell a few stories here. We can kind of see which one is most interesting. Our first partner in Nicaragua was working on micro hydro systems in rural communities at the time of civil unrest in the country in the late 80s. Following the death of Benjamin Linder, we started partnering with that organization, helped them develop a strategic plan, and continued to advance micro hydro projects. One of those projects that I think just really exemplifies the approach of green empowerment in so many organizations we work with is a 900 kilowatt micro hydro project that was inaugurated in 2007. And one of the reasons this is so exciting is because it started as this micro hydro project for a community. It now actually supports the municipal seed as well as 9 surrounding communities. And the local partner organization, which started out as it's the Association of Rural Development Workers, started out as a pretty small, scrappy nonprofit, much like ourselves, now actually has the concession to supply rural energy, now has the concession to supply electricity through the whole region with the Ministry of Electrification in Nicaragua. The thing that's really cool about that project, though, is just this last year, they were able to secure recognition from the Ministry of Environment in Nicaragua for the conservation of the area surrounding the micro hydro system. So it really shows how environmental justice can go along with social justice and these types of rural electrification projects, and that conservation project is actually also owned by the community. So it's a really great example of how working with local organizations based on what they see as the need is to supply electricity access can have all these other benefits as well.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought up social and economic justice because we're having this conversation in the midst of COVID-19 and in the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd at the hands of the police in the United States. How does environmental, economic, and social justice inform your work at Green Empowerment?
Unfortunately, the unjust killing of George Floyd and so many others is not uncommon both to the US and globally. And the systems that create the kind of power dynamics and racial inequalities and tensions that can lead to that type of police brutality and the other systemic issues that we have in our country really are pretty fundamental to why we have such global inequality. So a lot of that inequality is based off of racism and white supremacy. And, green empowerment while we are definitely not solving that on a systemic level, we do feel like we're against the status quo, and that we really think of our work in the context of anti-colonial approach to doing the work. So rather than a bunch of Western engineers going and installing projects somewhere, who are the people in these communities, in these countries doing this work? What are their gaps, and how can we support them to do this work in a way that leads to sustainable impact for their communities? So even though, it's a small piece of the pie, we really fundamentally believe that our partnership model and the holistic approach to doing projects is part of the path forward, because it's about listening to the communities most impacted. So whether that's the Black Lives Matter movement here in the US or indigenous rights groups in Malaysia and Borneo, making sure that we are listening to them and helping them lead the way and being a support resource for them, and using our privilege as a US based organization to do that. One of the things that I was just reading about this week that happens here in the US and globally is that a lot of minority led organizations are not able to access funding, whether that's impact investing funds or philanthropic funds, at the same rate that white led organizations can. So, what is our responsibility as a North American based organization to help get funding that is available to the communities or to the organizations in communities that are going to do this work? And that's where green empowerment, I think, is doing some things right. And we have been doing it for, over 20 years. And so we're learning always about how that looks, but, trying to recognize our part. One thing that might be relevant, I think, for your audience as well, is there was this great article in 2018 called Elephant in the Room. And it was about this fund, impact investing fund in Uganda for electrification. And they, I think, had over 50 people in the room to hear from these consultants about this fund. Not a single Ugandan practitioner was able to access the funding based on the terms. So that article really emphasizes to us that we are not building the systems of funding and financing for community leaders or for local practitioners to actually do this work. So what happens with that type of fund is about a bunch of international external companies end up winning that work. They aren't inherently wrong or bad, but the system wasn't designed for local practitioners to be able to access that funding to do the work in their home countries. And that's one of the things that green empowerment is interesting in supporting local practitioners to be able to access funding, but also talking about it and talking about how that is a really unfair system that's really built off the history of colonialism and the history of Western financing models.
Sure. And taking that approach helps eliminate the opportunity for future exploitation and brings broad-based sustainable development, both from an environmental perspective and then also from an economic perspective to those communities, which I think at Zpryme, we just are such big fans of that approach and the approach that green empowerment is taking.
Totally. I think that the combination of local partnership, community engagement, these are critical to addressing the immediate needs, but they also can environmental and social justice. And we think these are just fundamental, basic things that are needed for economic justice, which I think is a goal across the clean energy transition.
Absolutely. Let's dive into some of the specific projects that you're hoping to accomplish over the next few months and few years. Can you walk us through what some of those look like?
Sure. Actually, as it relates to COVID, your question that I kind of surpassed earlier, let me just highlight a few things there, if you don't mind, just because they might be relevant. So regarding COVID-19, for green empowerment, for globally, for rural communities, it really just emphasizes the need to invest in this basic infrastructure. So if we're talking about clean water for hand washing and renewable energy for health clinics, those are just basic things that will help prepare communities to be more resilient against pandemics, whether it's COVID or even climate change, as we see that coming down and having similar kind of global impacts. So part of building a more resilient global network is investing in this basic infrastructure. And I think similar to what we're talking about with racial what's happening here in the US with COVID-19, it's demonstrating that our healthcare system is similarly not set up to have equal access, especially Black people. And that's true globally, where if you look at where healthcare access is, a lot of rural healthcare access or even urban healthcare access doesn't have electricity access, which is necessary for vaccines and so many other healthcare services. So I think, unfortunately, while there's also an opportunity there, those things are actually quite connected where you're looking at healthcare injustice as well as racial injustice. So one of the exciting projects that we are working on right now, and we were actually working on this before COVID, it just seems even more timely right now, is renewable energy for health clinics. So we've been working along the Thai-Myanmar border since 2006, and in Peru, working on electrification of rural health clinics. And so the context in those two countries is incredibly different. In Myanmar, we actually started working with, we called them backpack doctors who would pack on solar panels and create these kind of, say that one more time. So in Myanmar, we actually were working with backpack doctors who would take their supplies and on their backs and hike in to within the Karen state of Myanmar and provide medical service to the internally displaced peoples. That situation has obviously evolved a lot over years, and now we're working with some of those same partner organizations to provide solar systems for now established healthcare systems and health centers that are actually providing healthcare services to returned displaced people in that area. In Peru, we've been doing that work, doing renewable energy and clean water for health clinics. And that situation just looks quite different. And the Ministry of Health is actually adopting our model. And they're going to be doing now renewable energy and health and solar hot water for their health clinics throughout the country. So that's really exciting. And what we're looking at doing now is how do we integrate renewable energy to healthcare and other services throughout sub-Saharan Africa. So we are working with a few organizations, looking at piloting a project this year in Uganda, specifically looking at renewable energy on healthcare systems for refugee populations. So this is really looking at the intersection of so many things, healthcare, clean energy, as well as displaced people. So it's an exciting opportunity. It feels very timely that we'd actually started working on this in late 2018, and now we're just trying to really hit the ground running given COVID-19.
Well, there's so many worthy projects that are needed around the world and that green power empowerment is addressing. How can people here in the United States or around the world get involved and support your work?
So the primary way to get involved with an organization like Green Empowerment is to donate. You know, we don't shy away from that. We are ourselves a nonprofit organization. But I think in the broader context of what we do, it's also just looking for other organizations that are challenging the status quo. You know, being conscientious as somebody in this space who wants to support work globally. So say you are an engineer, or maybe you have developed a really interesting technology that could be integrated into some of this work. How can you work with communities at the front lines that are working in their own communities? They understand the cultural context. And how do you think about combining those things? So whether you're developing a really cool cold storage system, or you're an engineer yourself who wants to volunteer some time, how do you find organizations that you think are really doing it the right way, where they're addressing these issues holistically? Because you know, we really can nerd out quite a bit on the technology. I mean, that's a lot of who we are as an organization, but we also know that technology often is actually the easy part. Understanding the funding mechanisms, the cultural context, the local challenges, land rights issues, those are really the challenges that make these projects successful. And the best way to overcome those is by working locally within the context and with local people who understand that and who are going to be there long term and committed to their home countries.
Well, Andrea, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about the green empowerment story. For those folks that are interested in helping out, they can go to greenempowerment.org and donate and keep abreast of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. I'm Chris Moyer, and this has been a Zpryme Now special report.